for is the VMware Vmvisor installer. Now, version 5, and in my case it's build 469.512. This is actually the ISO file that corresponds to the DVD you would use for installing ESXi. And obviously it has to be in the drive so that we can actually boot and install ESXi from the virtual disk. Now, if I choose the next button here, I have to select a guest operating system. If you've built Microsoft Windows virtual machines before, then you've selected the top button up here. What we're doing down here is a VMware ESX operating system. Our version in this case is set to ESX Server 4, and that's mainly because this version of Workstation was built before the release of ESX Server 5. Now, if your version includes ESX Server 5, go ahead and select that here, but you're going to be all right with ESX Server 4 in this case. Let me go ahead and hit the next button here, and I'm going to name this virtual machine esx1.company.pri, and I want to store this in the location on my desktop where I've actually been installing all of these virtual machines here in this little folder. Now, esx1.company.pri has a few more configurations, not the least of which is the number of processors that are available. Most virtual machines you want to start out with just a single processor and a single core. However, ESXi does have a requirement that you have a minimum of one processor and 2 cores per processor. If you install it in this way, you'll actually eliminate a little error message that you would get a little bit down the road. So make sure you've got 1 processor and 2 cores per processor if you're doing this on top of VMware Workstation. You also have to identify a minimum amount of memory for this virtual machine. I requires a minimum of 2 gigs of RAM just to get itself up and running. Now, this 2 gigs of RAM will allow ESXi to actually boot, but it doesn't really provide much in the way of extra memory so that you can run virtual machines on top of that booted ESXi instance. And so I'm actually going to double the amount of RAM that I'm providing to 4 gigs of RAM, and that gives me a little bit of buffer space so that I can run a couple of small virtual machines as demonstrations for future videos in this series. You will, like I said, have to have a minimum of 2 gigs of RAM, but if you want to do much more than just power on ESXi, I'd set it to 3 or 4. I choose the next button here, and I'm going to select Bridged Networking. If you want to actually isolate your ESX eval environment from your production environment, you might use network address translation or host-only networking. I'll choose the defaults here for my SCSI controller for creating a new virtual disk of type SCSI here and setting the maximum disk size to the default of 40 gigs, and also for setting the disk file name here at this point. Now, before you actually go to power on the virtual machine and start the ESXi installation, there's a couple of hardware customizations that you're going to want to do. The first of which is to eliminate the devices that are really unnecessary for use in the I environment. The first of which is this floppy disk here that you don't really need, nor do you need the USB controller. And we'll just get rid of them so that they're not there and don't cause any conflicts down the road. I also want to make sure that my display graphics, my 3D graphics, have been accelerated at this point, and I want to add in a couple of additional network adapters, in my case in bridged mode, because I may actually need to use these network adapters to segregate out my network traffic when I get to the networking sections, the networking nuggets a little bit further along in this series. You'll see further along having these additional network adapters just provides you more flexibility for making different configurations and for splitting up the different kinds of network traffic that we'll be using in a future nugget. At this point, I'm actually ready to begin the installation, so let me click the OK button here and then choose Finish, and you'll see that our ESX1 instance begins powering on. There's the VMware boot screen, and you can see the ESXi standard installer here from the boot menu. I'll hit the OK button here, or the Enter button, to begin the installation, and then again to start the automatic boot. And it's going to go through a series of loading of different modules that are required to get ESXi running. Now, at this point, you should see that we're loading some of the final modules that are required in order to get the ESXi installer up and running. This installation is in many ways